Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for ReadyForTheDraft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 28 of the 2020 podcast series, getting you ready for the NFL Draft, which is still set to begin April 23rd, no longer in Las Vegas, Nevada. The site is yet to be determined. And do we know just how many days this draft is going to be? Is it going to be 3 days? Is it going to be 7 days? There's talk that we may take the draft and really push it out over the course of 7 days, which really makes things awkward when we talk about, this guy's a day 2 pick. Well, day 2 pick means second or third round. But this year, we're in unprecedented times right now. So we no longer have Las Vegas. And Las Vegas, really, that was going to be the spectacle. You're talking about the backdrop of the Bellagio fountains. Guys were going to be boated out to the stage once their name has been called. And we really don't get that. So I think what the league is trying to do is trying to figure out the best way possible to really make it as much of a spectacle as possible, given the circumstances. So if we say day 2 pick, you're not talking about second round. It's still the second and third round. And we're talking about day 3, early day 3. You're talking about the 4th, maybe into the 5th round, late day 3, 6th, into the 7th round. So it is a little awkward when we talk about that, especially if they do end up expanding it over the course of 7 days. But really, when we're talking about the traditional sense of the draft, that's really what we're talking about here. Now, I preface this with all of my podcasts, since we've had all of the sheltering in place and the social distancing and such. People are at home and they need an outlet. They need something to talk about. They need to have something that takes their mind off of things. And why not talk about football? Why not talk about the NFL draft? I know the GMs, they were trying to push it back another month. And when you think about it, all the social distancing and the sheltering at home and everything else, we don't have pro days. So a lot of the guys that had a chance to compete at the combine opted for their pro days. Unless they had one of those early pro days like OU did, you're kind of out of luck at this point. But the GMs also having a lot of the psychological evaluations and the interviews and things like it just makes it a lot more difficult. Really not sure how that really comes into play. And I think they wanted more time to be able to do those evaluations, but the league got its way for the most part from the way it seems, and April 23rd is going to be the day. But again, I want to make sure that there is something to talk about, that there is something to look forward to, and why not have a debate over the NFL draft? Who's going to be going in round number 1 on through? And if you listen to the last podcast, I talked quite a bit about how my mock draft, if you give me time and you give me, allow me to look at it, I'll break it down and I'll overanalyze it and look at it all over again. I've already had to make changes since the first podcast that we did over the course of all of the NFL divisions, taking a look at each division and how the free agency impacted would impact the draft, impact each of the teams and their team needs. The mock draft looks a lot different than it did with that first podcast. And I believe that was episode 25 was the very first one. We did the NFC East, moved on to the AFC East. Now, NFC East was the last podcast, episode 27. We'll be talking about the AFC North here in just a moment. But I made sure to take the laptop, put it away, not even take a look at my mock draft, because look, I'm going to continue to look at things, look at the players, really, try to analyze and say, is this really a good fit? Is this player a second round pick or a third round pick? I do feel pretty comfortable about my first round. And look, if you look at my mock draft from last year, which is on the website, the very first mock draft, which was done in January, it actually ends up, panning out a lot better than my last mock draft. And the reason being is, I went with, off of my gut, off of my instinct. And then I got, really the overanalysis really got the better of me, because I looked at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as an example. And I said, you know what? There's no way that they're going to go Devin White, because they paid all this attention to the linebacking core in free agency. And what do? They take Devin White. That's who I had going to the Bucs in round number 1 of my very first mock draft. How about the Raiders? Cleveland Ferrell. I said, this guy is absolutely going to be a fit for the Raiders. Had him there at number 4 in my first mock draft. Ended up having him move down the board. Still had him going to the Raiders, but much later, where does he go? Number 4 overall. So I really have to trust my gut with this and not let any of these other outside factors really weigh in and really overanalyze things. I do think you do have to pay attention to free agency a little bit. It's a team like New Orleans, for example. If you're talking about New Orleans and you're looking at their team, everyone has them taking a receiver. They need to have a running mate for Michael Thomas. Now, look, they brought in Emmanuel Sanders. And Emmanuel Sanders, for me, I look at him and I think he's a reliable veteran, but not necessarily a guy who's going to be a long-term answer there as the running mate for Michael Thomas. You need to have that duo, but at the same time, what I'm looking at too is this pickup and acquisition may allow New Orleans to focus on other parts of their team, other need areas. And I'm looking at that linebacker position, and there are some definite needs there. And so what do? I'm looking at Patrick Queen. I'm looking at Kenneth Murray, a couple of guys who can play inside, they can play outside, really wherever that need is. They lost AJ Klein. Kiko Alonso took a pay cut and he's back. Actually, I think I got the wrong team there. But really when you look at that linebacking core, they need another guy. They have Demario Davis sitting there at one of the outside linebacker positions. And I looked at it and I said, all right, this is one of those picks to where I can look at it and say, look, the Saints, I think they could end up moving, passing on a receiver in round 1, take advantage of the depth of the wide receiver class and be able to pick up a guy in round number 2 or possibly even round number 3 and still make an impact and still be a guy that can be a running mate, for Michael Thomas. And I actually was right. It was Kiko Alonso there at middle linebacker. I had to make sure I looked that up and had that right off the top of my head. But that's really, when I look at the draft, I have to really weigh in what and decide what some of these off-field acquisitions, the free agency acquisitions, what that really means. When you lose guys, obviously that creates a huge hole. You bring in some of these guys, some of these veterans, and really what does that mean? Dallas brought in Clinton-Dix at safety, but I really see him as a one-year rental. I don't see him being a guy that's going to be a long-term answer for Dallas at the safety position. So what do? I got Grant Delpit in the second round to partner up with Xavier Woods on the back end of the Dallas Cowboy defense. So it's one of those things to where you can't always judge that free agency, completely with it. And I think for me, I have to really be cognizant of that, knowing that that's really what happens for me when I'm evaluating the draft. I've grown up watching the draft. I've done, this is probably, started it in 2000 when I was at USC, my last year at USC. I worked for the TV station. I was given a story. Here are all the USC draft eligible prospects and determine where they're going to go in the draft. And I did that. I had so much fun with it. I went ahead and mocked the first round of that 2000 draft, and the rest was history. 20 years later, I've still been putting together my mock drafts, and I'm having a blast doing it. And I think the history of the draft, understanding teams' tendencies and understanding where the fits would be, that's part of the fun of it. That's really part of the, that puzzle, really putting things together. So I try to look at things a little bit differently. I don't have a scale when you're talking about, the players and the analysis and you're working things through. A lot of it is going to be my gut. Over the 20 years that I've really been doing this, I watch over 200 plus college football games each and every year. My DVR and my wife, I don't know how my wife, really puts up with me with all the football games that I watch. But, by the end of the season, I feel pretty good about who the player is and where they really stand, what their draft stock is, and how they might translate to the NFL. So I feel pretty good about that. So let's take a look at the AFC North and really see, where I have things shaken out. And, after April, when we start looking at the post-draft, we'll see how I did. So we're going to go ahead and go in order, in terms of the first round picks really take a look at first Cincinnati, then Cleveland, and Baltimore. Now, Pittsburgh traded away their first round pick, so we'll save them for last. They do have a second rounder, so we'll get into Pittsburgh's draft last. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into Cincinnati's draft and really take a look at things. Zac Taylor sitting there as the head coach. 2019 really was a season of transition. 16 seasons. Marvin Lewis was there in Cincy, leading the Bengals to the playoffs 7 times, including 5 straight from 2011 to 2015. But sub 500 records in each of his final 3 seasons. Zac Taylor comes in, really has his work cut out for himself. Had a 6-10 record, and then ultimately in 2018, Andy Dalton in 2019 really struggled. This is a guy who started 133 games in his 10-year career with the Bengals. Struggles in the playoffs were apparent. Only 55.7% of his passes were completed, throwing just 1 touchdown to 6 interceptions over 5 wild card losses from 2011 to 2014. Taylor comes in from Sean McVay's staff after a 2-14 record in 2019. I really think the Bengals, with that number 1 overall pick, I think Zac Taylor is going to look to find his quarterback of the future. Dalton's also in the final year of his contract. Releasing him would save $17.7 million. They haven't done it yet, but everything points to Joe Burrow. Now, look, if Tua Tagovailoa were healthy and there weren't any issues with that hip, we could be talking about Tua as the number 1 overall pick. But with those injury concerns, I think, especially with the season that Joe Burrow had, college football fans really witnessed one of the most dynamic seasons from a quarterback in quite some time. So when you look at Joe Burrow and what he did, he started off there as a transfer from Ohio State, didn't get the starting job, battling with Dwayne Haskins, moves on to LSU and was a guy who was really seen as a late round pick or possibly even a priority free agent. And what does he do? His senior season, Joe Brady comes in as the passing game coordinator, over 5,600 yards to lead the country in passing yards, completion percentage at 76.3, pass efficiency at 202, passing touchdowns at 60, and swept all the major postseason awards, including a record-breaking Heisman Trophy victory, just a landslide victory over the runner-up Jalen Hurts. Dominated the college football playoff. 68.1% of his passes were completed, 956 yards, 12 touchdowns, and no interceptions. He had 7 touchdowns in the first half against OU. Just really staggering what Joe Burrow was able to do there. And, he's an Ohio native. A lot of people are talking about, well, what does he really want to go play in Cincinnati? He's already come out and said, look, I'll play wherever I get drafted. And Ohio, kid comes home and gets to play for, a quarterback coach who actually played quarterback at Nebraska and is in the same, coaching tree as Sean McVay. Why not? Why wouldn't you want to do that? And when you watch Joe Burrow play, the poise, I think, is the first thing that really jumps out. You never see this kid rattled. Even when in the national title game against Clemson, Clemson was really getting to him the first, couple of possessions. They were putting a lot of pressure. He never, not once, looked rattled. Ice water in his veins. This is a guy who sees the entire field, reads the defense, really knows where to go with the football at all times. I think one of the things that you really see is he throws the receivers open. Receivers, when the ball goes out of his hand, receivers aren't always going to be open, and he makes sure that he's throwing to a spot. Those receivers uncover themselves, make a play on the football, and get down the field. That's another thing, the ball placement and the anticipation, being able to hit a receiver in stride and allow him to make plays up the field without having to break stride, without having to adjust to a poorly thrown football. That was one of the things that made the LSU Tigers so lethal was, yes, he had a stacked wide receiver core with Justin Jefferson, who I have as my number 21 overall pick to Philly in the draft. Thaddeus Moss was his tight end. I have him coming off the board in round number 4 to the Saints. Terrace Marshall. And then arguably the number 1 wideout in next year's draft class, Jamar Chase. The list goes on, in terms of their weapons. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the running back, was the 3rd leading receiver in that receiving core, and he was a running back. But you look at him and just the poise. I mentioned that previously, but his pocket presence, his ability to feel the rush and be able to manipulate the pocket. I thought that was one of the things that really stood out as well. When you watch him play, he doesn't have to necessarily have a lot of the elusiveness in the pocket. He reminds me a lot of Aaron Rodgers with this ability to slide either to his left or right. Some of those subtle movements to be able to buy some time, allow his receivers to uncover coming across the field. But you also see he'll step up, he'll move to his left or move to his right. Really, you see a lot of Aaron Rodgers in him with the way that he plays. But here's the thing. He's also a tremendous athlete. He knows when to pull the ball and tuck it and run. He'll watch and read the defense. And if the defenders are turning their backs to him and the middle of the field is wide open, he's not afraid to pull the ball and tuck it and run. But at the same time, he's not not like some of the running quarterbacks who they want to try to run the ball and they get themselves into trouble at the next level. I don't see Joe Burrow doing that. He picks his shots. And really it's when he sees an opening and is able to rush for a significant amount of yardage, that's when he's really going to pull the football and take off. Really excellent decision-making. And look, 47% of his carries led to an LSU first down a season ago. I mean, that's something that I think is impressive. His ability to keep his eyes locked in down the field despite the pressure really allows him to see the throwing lanes, but also the running lanes open up. And if there's nobody to throw to, looking for a way to move the ball down the field, very decisive in his movements and very decisive with his arm strength as well, or with his passing. Doesn't have the arm strength that some of the other guys have on the roster. In this quarterback class, I should say. But he's very sound with what his decision-making process. And, I think when you look at him, his development in just a 1-year span from his junior year to his senior year there at LSU, that at the helm of a major FBS program, that has to get Zac Taylor excited about the possibilities in 2020 and beyond. They brought back AJ Green as a franchise tag. You've got Tyler Boyd. You also have John Ross, the speedster on the outside. If Green and Ross can stay healthy, you really have something there. You have a lot to work with for Joe Burrow. And then you have Joe Mixon, the running back out of the backfield as well. I think you've got some weapons there. I think you need to make sure that you protect him. You get him some additional weapons. And I think, Cincinnati's going to be in much better shape than a lot of people are predicting. People are looking at Cincy going, yeah, it's Cincy. But I think Zac Taylor, especially if he can get Joe Burrow in there, it's going to change the attitude, I'm telling you, there of the Bengals. The one thing I will say, though, for Joe Burrow, LSU, their mascot, the Tigers. You look at the Cincinnati, also the Bengals. What are Bengals? They're Bengal Tigers. There's already talk that Joe Burrow may be called the Tiger King. If I'm Joe Burrow, I think I might have to veto that nickname. Named. It's too closely linked to Joe Exotic. I think Joe Burrow may want to back off of that one just a little bit. Hopefully that never does stick with him. But moving on to the second round, number 33 overall. And look, I mentioned that they need to protect their quarterback, and they absolutely do. We saw that with Baker Mayfield, who we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. Baker ended up running around, really was gun shy in the pocket. And you saw that time and time again, with Cincy, Andy Dalton towards the end of his tenure there in Cincy, really started getting hit a lot more back there in the pocket. Look, the offensive line gave up 48 sacks this past season. And when you look at this roster, Cordy Glenn is gone. But, Jonah Williams is moving in at the right tackle position. At the left tackle position. He also has the versatility to play inside a guard if he needs to. But, at the end of the day, when I look at it, I'm looking at Billy Price at left guard. They brought in Xavier Suafilo to man the right guard position. So I think really what they need to do, they've got Bobby Hart's in there at right tackle, but I think they need an upgrade at the right tackle position. And Austin Jackson out of USC, look, this is a guy who could very well end up being a left tackle. And you could very well end up seeing them move Austin Jackson to left tackle, Jonah Williams to right tackle, because Jonah Williams, remember, has experience at both tackle positions. Jackson, 6'5", 322 pounds, out of USC, the junior. And look, there are a lot of things to like about Austin Jackson. When he gets out and fires out of his stance, beats the guy off the line, and really is allowed to set up, his kick slide, takes an excellent angle, really light on his feet, has long arms. His athleticism is what you really see, but he got overpowered, quite a bit by some of the edge rushers, especially AJ Epinesa in that Holiday Bowl. If you watch that game, he did a really good job for a lot of that game against AJ Epinesa, and I was really beating him out of the stance. He really had to fire off quickly and set up and really take a good angle. If you take one of those angles down the line and really those horizontal kick slides, I really have never been a fan of those, because essentially what you're doing is, if that edge rusher is able to get up the field in a hurry, you've lost any leverage that you would have had there on the outside. Austin Jackson, when he was getting beaten, it was one of those things to where Epinesa was winning and really attacking that outside shoulder, and Jackson would try to force him up the field. But the thing with it was Epinesa would overpower him, really end up taking away that edge, really getting more of a soft edge coming off there, beating him to the inside as well. And I think it's one of those things, he really needs to improve some of that core strength overall. But, there is a chance that Austin Jackson could end up being a first rounder. I think he has that type of athleticism, but I think there's still enough rawness there to his game that I would kind of back off of Austin Jackson in round number 1. But, top of round 2 really makes a lot of sense there. I think moving on in round number 3, Tyler Eifert, he had an injury-riddled career there in Cincinnati. He's no longer the tight end. You have CJ Uzomah, Drew Sample at tight end for Cincinnati. I think they really need to find another pass catcher, a decent athlete that can be out there and be a weapon up the seam. And look, you're also going to need a guy who's going to be able to hang back and be a nice run blocker, also be able to protect the quarterback a little bit. And I'm looking at Brycen Hopkins out of Purdue. Now Brycen Hopkins, he's 6 foot, 6'4", 245 pounds, ran a 4.66 40 at the combine. Not explosive per se, but I thought that his vertical speed is definitely there. Remember Rob Gronkowski ran a 4.68 at the combine, so pretty comparable there. When you watch Brycen Hopkins play again, a weapon, getting up the seam, really has a knack for getting open. I think he displays some nice soft hands in the passing game as well. In his career there at Purdue, had a breakout 2019 season. 61 catches, 830 yards, and 7 touchdowns on the year. And when you're talking about complete tight ends, I mentioned that Cole Kmet was the most complete tight end, but I think number 2 has to be Brycen Hopkins. And I kind of gave the nod to Kmet. I think he's a little bit better blocker than Hopkins, but I think Hopkins probably will end up being the better pass catcher, at least in terms of being dynamic down the football field. So I think getting a weapon there at the tight end position, look, I think Hopkins can come in and start on this roster right away. So then if you move to round number 4, and when you look at this roster, round number 4 for Cincinnati, I'm looking at their edge rushers. They have Carlos Dunlap, Sam Hubbard as their starters, Carl Lawson, there's Andrew Brown as their core backups. And, I think Cincinnati needs to really focus on their depth. And I think that's really going to be one of the big things that that we're going to be seeing in the draft at some point is Cincinnati making a move, finding somebody that they can bring in. And I'm on spottrack.com right now because I want to go ahead and pull up what the contract status looks like for these guys. So Lawson and Brown are only signed through 2020. Dunlap is 31 years of age. He's only signed through 2021. Sam Hubbard also 2021. So, I think, the time is now. Time is right to get get some pass rushers, get another pass rusher in there and on the roster. And I've got Jonathan Garvin out of Miami, a guy who I was a little surprised that he came out a year early as a junior. But we'll get into it just a minute. I think he has some pass rush capability. Now, I mentioned, Dunlap and Hubbard, they combined for 17 and a half sacks. And, Geno Atkins working on the interior of that line had 4.5 sacks as well. Carl Lawson with 5. And those were really your 4 pass rushers that really did any damage in the backfield. You got to get another guy that can really put pressure on the quarterback and strike some fear coming off the edge. And Jonathan Garvin, here's the thing. I think in the 4th round, you can get a guy who's going to have some of that potential and not really have to worry about him necessarily making an impact year 1. I think he'll be a rotational guy and a guy that can ultimately step in, especially if Carl Lawson or Andrew Brown is off the roster in 2021. Now, you look at Garvin, really a breakout 2018, had 17 tackles for loss and 5.5 sacks. And look, he had 60 tackles, very active at the defensive end position. In 2019, saw production in terms of the tackles way down with 37, 9 tackles for loss, 5 sacks. So really a drop of sorts in production. You really want to hopefully get him back to that 2018 form. And I think getting him into an NFL locker room, getting a defensive line coach there in the league, really going to help with that. So in our previous mock drafts with this road show or tour of the NFL divisions for the free agency and what that really did for the draft and for the teams and the rosters, we've only done the first 4 rounds, but I actually went ahead and finished up my 5th round. It's not on the website just yet. I did update the website though, so I do have my updated mock draft on there, the first 4 rounds, ready for the draft.com. 5th round will be on there shortly. And honestly, when you look at this team, they did sign Mike Thomas as another receiver, but you've got Green, you've got Ross, you got Boyd. Green and Ross have their injury history. Alex Erickson is an excellent possession receiver. Then Auden Tate, the bigger tight end type receiver, big bodied guy. I'm looking at them possibly getting another receiver in there. Is Mike Thomas really going to be the answer? Really don't know what's going to happen there. But I'm looking at a guy like James Prochet. For whatever reason, for me, I'm just looking at the fit. And looking at what Zac Taylor wants to do offensively and, Joe Burrow, I think James Prochet can end up being a favorite target of Joe Burrow's. And Prochet, if you haven't seen him play there at SMU, you gotta find his highlights. This guy, has a flair for the acrobatic, excellent hands, back-to-back, 1,000-yard seasons, nearly had back-to-back 1,200-yard seasons, was just 1 yard shy of the 1,200-yard mark in 2018. But look, over 300 catches, 3,949 yards, 39 touchdowns, including double-digit touchdowns in each of the last 2 seasons. And he's a guy that I think in any other year, other than this year with this depth at the receiver position, he'd probably be a 3rd-round pick. Maybe talking about him a lot more. We just haven't really talked about him because, well, frankly, unfortunately, he kind of gets lost in the shuffle a little bit. But, when I look at James Prochet, 5'11", 201, he's one of those guys who is just so difficult to cover. And I talked about Cooper Kupp in the last podcast and how he at the Senior Bowl wasn't the fastest guy in the world. And I don't think Prochet is the fastest guy either, but the savviness with the route running, his ability to win off the line, nobody could cover Cooper Kupp. And I felt the same way with James Prochet. This is a guy who just knows how to get open. And that's one of the things I think Joe Burrow, if you can get yourself open, if you can uncover yourself, Joe Burrow is going to get you the football. And I think that's really a nice match there for the Bengals. And especially in round number 5, I think that'd be a steal. So moving on to Cleveland, the Browns. And look, Cleveland in 2019, this was supposed to be the year. You have Baker Mayfield coming off a impressive rookie performance. And you bring in, a lot of the different free agents. And you look at it. Okay, so Odell Beckham Jr. Teaming with Jarvis Landry. You got Nick Chubb running the football, prime for a breakout season. Myles Garrett, Joe Schobert, Denzel Ward really running what looked like a top 10 defense, but unfortunately, one of the more disappointing teams. Expectations were really high for Freddie Kitchens after what he was able to do as Mayfield's offensive coordinator the season before, but he looked overmatched. As a head coach, managed just 6 wins, drafted in the top 10 yet again. And look, the dog pound, they're thirsty for success. And really, in order for Baker Mayfield to take that next step forward as a quarterback, he has to be protected. And I mentioned it earlier, but too often he was vacating the pocket early, way too early. And a lot of times I saw it all over Twitter, and social media, where Baker Mayfield had an opportunity to step up, to buy time, find a guy down the field, and instead he was rolling out, running for his life, either to his left or right. And that's really one of the issues that Baker Mayfield had. Even when he had time, he was vacating the pocket, and it was really because he didn't trust his offensive line. He had Greg Robinson at left tackle, and Greg Robinson, look, he's got the legal troubles now. He's not going to be back. Chris Hubbard struggled there at the right side with speed coming off the edge. And look, you knew they were serious when they brought in Jack Conklin in free agency. That's a huge signing, but the left side still needs help. That's really where you have to turn your attention if I'm the Cleveland Browns, is the left side of that line. And look, I think one of the 4 top tackles is going to come off the board here. I think, really what you're looking at is, what are the Giants going to do? If the Giants end up taking Jedrick Wills, then I think this pick, could potentially, because Arizona is more than likely going to take an offensive tackle as well. They need to protect Kyler Murray. So that could potentially be, especially with DJ Humphries at the left tackle position, that could be Tristan Wirfs. You could also put Mekhi Becton there. But if the Giants end up taking Isaiah Simmons, as I have them pegged to do right now, then I'm looking at this pick. I think it feels more and more like Mekhi Becton is just the right fit. And look, Baker Mayfield is used to playing with a mammoth dude playing at left tackle. He had Orlando Brown Jr. playing there in his days with the Sooners. And Mekhi Becton, look, he's also used to a guy who moves in and out of the pocket. He played with Lamar Jackson there at Louisville. Baker Mayfield is a guy who will want to move around, move the pocket, and buy some time. And you have to have an offensive line that's used to blocking for a guy who is a mobile quarterback. And Becton, I mentioned how big he is. 6'7", 368 pounds. Good Lord. This guy's just huge. And if you've seen him on social media, he's sitting there pushing a truck down the street and just getting those short choppy steps and really generating the movement. There's really not a shock. A guy that's that big, generating that type of movement. Now, Dane Brugler, one of the NFL draft experts, I really liked his comparison, so I wanted to give a shout out to him. Talked about Bryant McKinnie and the comparison there. Now Bryant McKinnie was the 7th overall selection of the 2002 draft. In terms of his size, very comparable to Becton's. Ran a 5.13 40 at the combine as well for a guy that size. Now Becton, what did he do at the combine? He ran himself a 5.10 40. And really what happened there, that kind of cut his combine short due to an injury. But, I think running a 5.10 40 at 6'7", 368 pounds, I think that really tells you the type of athleticism that this guy has. And not to mention, the enormous size allows him to engulf defenders at the point of attack. Kick out blocks are legendary. Firing out of his stance, really just showing so much power that he's driving guys, picking them up and just kind of throwing them off, throwing them to the ground, driving guys off their feet. Really wants to punish this man on the edge, looking to finish his blocks. But, as I said, the surprising agility for a man his size, his zone blocks in the running game, decent footwork in his pass sets on the outside. Even if an edge rusher beats him off the ball, just his sheer size alone forces the rusher to really make a wider arc, which allows him to use his length, that enormous wingspan that he has, to really drive the man out of the play. I think the biggest concern right now for him is his weight. Can he be disciplined enough to keep that from being an issue? Pad level can also be a concern at 6'7". That can get a little bit high at times, and really at that point, his hands end up getting a lot higher as well. So his striking, either he's striking down on a guy, or the pad, the hands come up a little bit higher, and he really loses a lot of that leverage and that momentum and that effectiveness of that power that he has. So that a naturally high center of gravity, it's easy for him to be off balance as well. So he needs to make sure that he remains patient, remains with that low base. And if he fires off the ball and stays low, this guy can really be a beast there on the outside, protecting Baker Mayfield's blind side. I think Cleveland has to do that first and foremost in this draft. Now, moving on to round number 2. If you're looking at Cleveland and you look at that line, yes, they signed Andrew Billings there to back up Larry Ogunjobi on one side. You've got Sheldon Richardson on the other side, and we're talking about the defensive tackle position. But I think when you're looking at depth and you're looking up front for Cleveland, I think that's one of the things. It starts in the trenches, right? I think my dad was one who always said you're only as good as your offensive and defensive lines. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I'm looking at Ogunjobi. He's a free agent at the end of this season. Sheldon Richardson will be a free agent at the end of next season. And they need to make sure that they are stout at the point of attack, stout in the middle of that line. And I'm looking at a guy like Ross Blacklock, a twitched up guy there at the defensive tackle position, coming out of TCU, coming out a year early. But the thing with Blacklock, that was so impressive was a guy who can bend, for a guy his size, at the defensive tackle position, there's game film. If you look at some of his highlights, being able to shoot off the ball, dip that inside shoulder, on an interior lineman, and really show some of that bend and that ankle flexion to get underneath the pad level and run really a tight arc coming off that edge to the quarterback. And he's, rushing off of an interior lineman, at 6'4", 305 during the season, showed up at the combine a little bit lighter, at 6'3", 290, ran a 4.9 40 there at the combine. And so when you look at and talk about athleticism, he definitely has that. And, when you look at some of his playmaking ability there for TCU, 15.5 tackles for loss and 5.5 sacks in just 2 seasons there with TCU. I really think that this is a guy that can fit in. I think his best days are ahead of him. I think he's just scratching the surface on his potential. And he doesn't have to start right away. You do have Ogunjobi, you do have Richardson sitting there ahead of him. But, I think this is a guy who could be primed for a breakout season in 2021. I wouldn't expect him to, I think he'll be more of a rotational guy starting out, but that athleticism and the potential, I wouldn't take him in round number 1. I had him kind of flirted with putting him in round number 1 with a couple of teams, but I think you save him for round 2. I think Cleveland would really have something here with him, there at the top half of round number 2, 41 overall. So then Cleveland's next pick is in round number 3, and they have 3 third-round selections. And I'm actually eyeballing a guy who could be a 3-4 outside linebacker. He's a little undersized, 6'3", 248 pounds, and that's Alex Highsmith. But when you look at this, the defensive end position, you've got Myles Garrett. Obviously, we know the talent that he is. Olivier Vernon is sitting there on the outside as well. Chad Thomas and Brian Cox are really the other situational guys that are there on the edge as well. And there are some concerns when you look at that line. When you talk about a guy like Olivier Vernon, he's 29 years of age. He'll be a free agent at the end of the season. So his long-term commitment to the Browns really is in doubt and in question. So you're looking for a pass rusher. And what I like so much about Alex Highsmith, he's one of the higher rated group of 5 guys on my own draft board. And the reason being is this guy's always been a terror for offensive lines and making plays in the backfield. So quick off the ball and able to shoot into the backfield. As a junior, 18.5 tackles for loss, 60 tackles, but he only had 3 sacks. So this was a guy who was really making a lot of plays in the backfield, but wasn't really getting home to the quarterback. What does he do in 2019? He really develops some pass rush moves and the instincts to get after the quarterback. And 21 and a half tackles for loss, 15 sacks on the year to go along with 75 tackles. Very athletic. He's playing the defensive end position there for Charlotte. And I think Alex Highsmith, you put him in there, and ultimately, if he's playing alongside opposite Myles Garrett, I think that's something that I think he can make an impact year one. And if Olivier Vernon moves on, you've definitely got a guy who can move in there and take over his spot. I think he has the build to pack on some size and still not lose his athleticism. He lined up with the linebackers. I'm sorry, no, he actually lined up with the defensive ends at the combine. Ran a 4.7 40, and I think he's got really good athleticism. I think he can learn from Olivier Vernon and ultimately take over if Vernon does move on. So staying in round number 3, and I mentioned Cleveland has 3 third round selections. They had 74 overall, which was their pick, and then they select again at number 87 overall. This is the pick from New England, and I'm actually looking at a receiver for them at this point. Now you're saying, well, they've got Jarvis Landry and they've got Odell Beckham Jr. Why would you do that? Well, Rashard Higgins is no longer on the roster. They've got Tywan Taylor, Damian Ratley. The whole experiment with Antonio Caldwell didn't work out. So what do you do there? And I'm actually looking at KJ Hamler. A lot of people think that KJ Hamler could potentially be a first rounder. The drops really scare me. This is a guy who isn't a natural pass catcher. He's not a guy who's going to go up and attack the football in the air, but I'm looking at him in round number 3. He has the athleticism to make plays down the football field. I think he's worth a shot in round 3. You go any earlier, and I think you're bound to be disappointed. 5'9", 178 pounds, and again, very athletic, very explosive there for Penn State. Was the favorite target of Sean Clifford, the quarterback there, and only played 2 seasons. He's a redshirt sophomore coming out, and Hamler. Let's see, this past season, Hamler 56 catches. 904 yards, 8 touchdowns. In his career, 16.9 yards per reception. A guy who can just be very explosive. I think you put him in the slot, especially when you're talking about some of these receivers that he has in Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry. You put a guy in the slot with the speed of KJ Hamler, allow him to go to work there on the inside, and that may free some things up for Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry. If you put the focus on those 2 guys, then KJ Hamler is going to have to prove that he has the hands to be able to be that type of target, to take some of that pressure off of those guys. Because look, if you continue to cover those guys on the outside, then you've got your slot receiver in Hamler with the speed, getting vertical and really stretching things up the seam. That's going to open up passing lanes when it's all said and done. So I think KJ Hamler would be a nice pick there for Cleveland in round number 3. And then the final pick of Cleveland, number 97 overall, one of the compensatory selections, got it from Houston. And I think they continue the look at that offensive line. And look, I mentioned that Baker Mayfield was really running for his life a lot of times. And I'm looking at the interior of that line, and Joel Bitonio at left guard, Wyatt Teller at right guard. They're projected as the starters. Austin Corbett, was traded to the Rams. They got him. Really was kind of a disappointment. I was expecting him to be the next Joel Bitonio. Didn't really pan out that way. I think you need to get another guard in there to challenge those two. And I'm looking at Robert Hunt out of Louisiana. Well, this is a guy who generates a ton of movement as a tackle for the Raging Cajuns. He's 6'5", 323 pounds, and a guy who I just think he's a nice. He's not the offensive tackle. I think he can definitely be a starter early in his career, moving inside to the guard position. And I'm looking at him. That was a team that had 3 talented running backs, and he was really the guy that kind of paved the way. He and Kevin Dotson, the guard, who I think is going to be a 5th round pick. They had Raymond Calais, they had Trey Regis and Elijah Mitchell. Calais is going to be in this year's draft. Regis and Mitchell will be in next year's draft. And so with that trio of running backs, you're running behind Hunt. This is a guy who I think is really sound in the running game. I don't think he has the athleticism laterally to take care of the speed rushers off the edge in the passing game. So I'm looking at that tackle position. I think that kind of rules things out, but you put him there at guard and allow him to go to work, be physical at the point of attack. I think that's really where his home is going to be. And I like that pick for Cleveland there in round number 3 towards the end of that round. And then finally looking at round number 4. And, I had initially had this pick going around earlier, but you're looking at the middle of that line, and yes, they picked up B.J. Goodson, and Sione Takitaki is sitting there at middle linebacker as well, but you can't really replace Joe Schobert. Joe Schobert was a guy coming in from Wisconsin. He was a 5th-round pick, and all he did was just ball out. This was a guy, just a Pro Bowl season, getting after the quarterback. Was a tackling machine. Dropping back into coverage as well, could do a little bit of everything. And that's really what Willie Gay Jr. was able to do for Mississippi State. He definitely has those off-field issues, missed 8 games, and, he really has to answer for that. But I'm looking at him and I'm looking at this defense, and you bring a guy like Gay in, and as long as he can keep his nose clean and not get into any trouble, this is a tremendous athlete. 4.46 640 at the combine, bench press 225 21 times, which was one of the higher numbers among the linebackers. 39.5-inch vertical leap at 6'1" and 243 pounds. Definitely a tremendous athlete. There's no doubt about that. I mentioned the issues off field that he's going to have to answer to, but his production. Look, he only played in 5 games, but in those 5 games, 28 tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss, had an interception that he returned for 52 yards for a touchdown. But the previous season, 48 tackles, 5.5 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, couple of interceptions as well. A guy who I think is a thumper coming downhill. Has that sideline to sideline ability, can drop into coverage a little bit, although I see some stiffness in his hips, covering the tight ends out of the backfield, or covering the tight ends and the running backs out of the backfield, excuse me. But, that's the same thing could have been said about Joe Schobert when he first came out of Wisconsin. But I think the athleticism is really, is absolutely there. And again, it's a big if, but if he can stay out of trouble, this could end up being a steal in round 4. And I think he would definitely replace Joe Schobert. He has that type of athleticism. He has that type of skill. So it'd be interesting to see how those interviews really fared with some of the teams. He could very well end up moving into day 2 consideration, meaning the 3rd round. But I think 4th round probably makes a lot of sense there for Cleveland. And, I think it makes a ton of sense for me. Now Cleveland doesn't have a 5th round pick. They traded it away to Buffalo, number 156 overall. So, we won't be talking about the 5th round for them, but I think if Cleveland can obviously address the offensive line with a couple of those picks, get another weapon for Mayfield and address that defensive line, and obviously address the middle linebacker position, you may have something there for the Browns. I think the future is still bright. It's not one of those. I'm not one that's going to necessarily say that Baker Mayfield is a bust or anything like that. Look, year 3 is usually a telltale sign for what you're going to get out of a quarterback. So really, this is a make or break season, I think, for Baker Mayfield. But Cleveland also has to give him a fair shake out of it too, with the offensive line that's going to block for him. And if you get in Becton to team with Jack Conklin, you shore up the interior of that line, and that's really where things are going to get going. Despite the offensive line struggling, Nick Chubb still had a fantastic season, was among the top 3 in the league in rushing. So imagine what he could do behind an offensive line that's a lot more sound. It could be really interesting there in Cleveland. So we'll move on to Baltimore with the league MVP Lamar Jackson. And look, what Lamar Jackson did was just phenomenal. This was a guy who was just absolutely unstoppable, whether it was with his legs or with his arm. Was just a talented quarterback, and unanimous MVP. No question there who was going to be the league's most valuable player. And so Baltimore, they still ultimately didn't make it to the Super Bowl, ended up getting bounced out, in the divisional round. And I think, when you're looking at the Ravens, I think you have to really eyeball that defense. A big holdover is Matt Judon. They put the franchise tag on him. They were able to keep him at outside linebacker. He had a big season a season ago. But when you look at that team, it's, man, the inside linebacker position, Patrick Onwuasor and, Josh Bynes both gone. They haven't really replaced anyone there. So I think they're really going to be looking at that inside linebacker position. Jalen Ferguson and Matt Judon there on the outside as rush ends, but they have no depth behind them. They did trade for Calais Campbell, and they signed Derek Wolfe from the Broncos. So they really have, they're set up front with Brandon Williams playing the nose tackle. Look, Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphrey at the cornerback position, Jimmy Smith, the veteran, on there. They have some other talented youngsters, and I think Earl Thomas at the free safety position. I think they're set there. But defensively, I'm looking at Baltimore, and I really think that they are going to go with an inside linebacker. And, I wrestle between, Patrick Queen and Kenneth Murray. At the end of the day, if Patrick Queen's off the board, I think Kenneth Murray is ultimately going to be your guy. I think Yetur Gross-Matos could potentially be in there if you're looking for another outside linebacker. But, the fact that they have Judon and you have Jalen Ferguson, a guy who, can be more of that bull rusher coming off the edge, I think that allows them to ultimately focus on that interior linebacker position. And really look, inside linebacker, they traded away CJ Mosley to the Jets before the season last year. Then they traded Kenny Young to the Rams in that deal that brought Marcus Peters over. So I really think they have to focus on that linebacker position. And when you talk about Kenneth Murray, the athleticism was allowed him to really fly around to the football there as a 3-down linebacker, really a perfect match for what the Ravens want to do defensively. This is a guy who racked up over 300 tackles in 3 seasons at OU, sideline to sideline speed, ability to penetrate the line of scrimmage, athleticism to run with any tight end in the league. There's no doubt about that. Ran a 4.5 240 at the combine before a hamstring injury ended his day there. Makes plays behind the line of scrimmage, 36.5 tackles for loss. Showed he could rush the passer, finishing with 9.5 sacks, and also broke up 6 passes in coverage. So he can drop into coverage as well. Mentioned that 4.5 240 at the combine, also a 38-inch vertical leap, broad jump of 10 feet 9 inches as well. That hamstring really, I think, was kind of lingering from that Peach Bowl where he was chasing after Joe Burrow, flushed him from the pocket, and ultimately had to pull up because of that hamstring. And I think that's just kind of that lingering injury, even though it was a couple of months later. I think that's ultimately what was still bothering him, and that's ultimately what flared up there. But I think he absolutely checks the box off. He's the guy that you want to have coming off the bus. Just looks like a chiseled freak of nature, and the athleticism absolutely allows him to be that playmaker. He does struggle with gap integrity against the run, finds himself out of position a lot, over pursuing plays, giving up big yards in the process. I thought he looked better this past season under Alex Grinch. His first couple of years there at OU just seemed to be out of position a lot. And teams, when they wanted to attack the OU defense, they would run up the gut. And really, that was Kenneth Murray playing out of position. And I thought he was really a lot more effective when Caleb Kelly came in and returned to play inside and allowed Murray to play outside, where he could freely roam around and make plays in space. Allow him to quickly read and react, break on the football, shoot gaps downhill to disrupt run plays, can scrape over the top to meet running backs off tackle, takes on blockers, stacking and shedding before wrapping up, and really driving through the ball carrier as well. The lateral quickness is off the charts, working inside out, beating the ball carrier to the perimeter. Excellent spying the quarterback, showing off that speed once the quarterback breaks the pocket to get downhill, takes the proper angle, chasing down the passer. I thought he played much more under control under Alex Grinch in 2019 as well. And previously, he wouldn't really break down. He wouldn't square himself to the ball carrier, and ultimately would end up playing himself out. And so I think that his ability to, I thought he was very coachable. It showed that he was coachable. He was able to really progress and develop as a player. So I think some of the issues with the gap integrity, he can work with a linebacker coach, I think, on the interior of that line. The athleticism, is something that you just can't teach. He's somebody who just, he reads the quarterback's eyes, makes quick reads, really allows it to take him to the football, reads the screens and pop passes, able to split some blocks on the perimeter, flies to the receiver, keep him from allowing any yards after catch, ultra aggressive, pinch for making plays, that'll get him out of position. It will get him fooled, take some poor angles as a result of that. Some of that lack of recognition at times, you worry about his ability to play inside, as I mentioned, but you get him into that NFL, linebacker room. And I think that's something that they can really work with. He has a lot of the tools to be an explosive linebacker at the next level. So I'm looking at round number 2, and I mentioned the outside linebacker position. If a guy like Terrell Lewis falls into their laps, he just looks like a Baltimore Ravens linebacker. So why not pick the kid up there in round number 2? 6'5", 260 pounds. And, he broke his leg in 2018, out for the year. I'm sorry, I think he actually tore his ACL, but nevertheless, in 10 games in 2019, 31 tackles, 11 and a half tackles for loss, 6 sacks. But the numbers don't just tell the whole story. This is a guy who was just so explosive. A lot of times he felt like a one-trick pony and was more of a situational pass rush guy. Wasn't a starter full-time there for Bama. But this is a guy who just always seemed to get home to the quarterback. So explosive off the edge. Linemen were having a hard time firing quick enough off the ball because this was a guy who was just getting by them. He would attack that outside shoulder, able to bend, dip, and rip and come off the edge and really flatten out and pressure the quarterback in a hurry. He reminds me of a lot of, Ravens outside linebackers. And I think you bring him in, allow him to be that situational pass rush guy, really learn and develop behind a guy like Mac Judon, who I thought, really, he's now really hitting his stride, and you saw him really progress year over year. If Terrell Lewis can do the same, I think that'd be a heck of a pickup there in round number 2. And that's actually, let's see, Baltimore picking at number 55 overall. It was a pick from New England. That's ultimately where they got that pick. So let's see, their second pick in round number 2 is number 60 overall. Now Marshall Yanda is retired. It's one of those things I think, kind of caught you off guard a little bit. This was a guy, just a perennial Pro Bowler, just a model professional there at the guard position. He's gone. So now that he's gone, that really leaves Bradley Bozeman as a lone guard on the roster with, any experience there, for the Ravens. They have, Parker Ehringer there from he played in Kansas City, but, there's not really a whole lot of depth behind them either. And I think that's really a cause for concern. You have Patrick McCrary. He got some playing time. The tackle out of Cal that they moved inside to guard, I think that's ultimately where he fits best. They have Matt Skura. Matt Skura is coming off of a leg injury as well at the center position. I'm looking at the guard position, and I'm looking at Netane Muti. And Muti is a guy who is just so physical. He's a mauler. He wants to beat you up, chew you up, spit you out. Essentially, this is going to be a guy, a mauler, a road grader, generates a ton of movement there. 6'3", 315 pounds. He's battled injuries throughout his career, had another ACL injury in 2019. But when he's healthy, this guy is, he just generates a ton of movement. And that's really the thing that you see. He beats guys up, generates a ton of movement. Reminds me of Will Hernandez when he was coming out of UTEP. Just a guy who, just wants to beat you up. 44 reps at 225 in the bench press, so extremely strong as well. The big issue for him is going to be, can he stay healthy? Is he going to be a second rounder? Could he fall because of the injury history? That's really the biggest question. Are the medicals going to check out? This is a guy who's been injured every single year there. He's been at Fresno State, coming out as a junior. That's the one part that I worry about with him is can he stay healthy? If he can, then, I think he's somebody who can easily work into Baltimore starting lineup early. And, if you can get physical for Mark Ingram and Lamar Jackson, that's really going to be a lot of fun, especially when you have Orlando Brown and Ronnie Stanley playing the tackle positions. So you move on to round number 3, and I mentioned that inside linebacker position, and I think this is where the Baltimore Ravens are going to double up. I really do. So they're sitting at number 92 overall, and I'm looking at Jordan Brooks, 6 foot, 245 pounds, out of Texas Tech, and this guy, he's just an athlete. He's a ball player. He wore number 1 there at Texas Tech, and a guy that just flew around to the football. That's one of the things that I thought was evident when you watched him play. Over 100 tackles in 2019. 20 tackles for loss. Really put everything together. This was a guy who was on the field a lot. He was a 4-year starter, averaged over 80 tackles a season in his first 3 seasons. But in terms of those tackles for loss, a guy that really wasn't known for making plays behind the line of scrimmage, just had 12 tackles for loss in his first 3 seasons, 20 as a senior, 3 sacks as well. Nearly equal the total sacks in his first 3 seasons at 3.5. A guy, like I said, just flies around to the football, very instinctive player, plays incredibly fast as well. I think you put him alongside Kenneth Murray and you have a couple of really athletic linebackers, and that's really what the Ravens want to get back to, is have some of those athletic linebackers in that linebacking core in the middle of the line. And Brooks, ran a 4.5 4.40 at the combine as well. So when you're talking about the speed, at that linebacker position coming into this draft, Jordan Brooks, there were only a few guys that were faster than him. You had, Isaiah Simmons with his 4.39, Willie Gay, who we just mentioned, and Davion Taylor. Those were the 3 guys that ran sub 4.5. Patrick Queen, Sean Bradley out of Temple, and Kenneth Murray, who I already have going to the Raiders there, and then Jordan Brooks. All of these guys ran sub 4.55. And so if you get 2 of those linebackers, you get Murray and you get Brown, it makes too much sense for me. You really need to get the future of that linebacking core, and I think it's a match made in heaven. So looking at the Ravens there, round number 3, they've got another pick there, and it's really at the bottom of round 3. So if we are talking 3 days of the draft, this would be the end of day number 2, number 106 overall, compensatory selection. And I'm looking at that receiver position, and you may be asking why, because, there's Marquise Brown on the roster, Miles Boykin, another tremendous athlete on the outside. But after that, there's Willie Snead, Jaleel Scott really hasn't gotten anything going. Chris Moore, kind of an up and down athlete. DeAnthony Thomas, a smaller type wide receiver there. I think what they really need to do is get a big bodied receiver, get a big dude out there on the outside. You've got Mark Andrews, Nick Boyle at the tight end position as well, but give Lamar Jackson a big physical wide receiver on the outside. And how about Antonio Gandy Golden out of Liberty? This guy is a monster. He's 6'4", 223 pounds, ran a 4.6 40. So the straight ahead speed, not all that impressive, but, repped out 225, 22 times, still had a 36-inch vertical leap. So there is some lower body explosiveness, very physical as well. And I think what you see with him is, the catch radius. His catch radius is huge. Just put the ball anywhere near this guy. He's going to extend for the football. He's a hands catcher. He's a natural pass catcher. Looks very comfortable. If you saw him run the gauntlet, a guy who just looked very smooth, easy pass catcher. And it's one of those things to where you don't have to just hit him in the frame. There are a lot of guys who, if you throw the ball anywhere off of his frame, he's not able to adjust to that football. Antonio Gandy-Golden, he's a big dude, but AGG can absolutely adjust to that football in the air. And it's one of those things, what's, poetry in motion is him out there along the sideline. The ability to extend for the football, a lot of times being put away from the defensive back, out of bounds. And here's a guy who can fully extend, keep his toes in bounds, and be able to fully extend for that football and make the catch. Gandy-Golden there at Liberty, really took off under Hugh Freeze. I'm a huge fan of his. I think he's a guy that, third round, he could. It's another thing with that receiving core. Should he be a second rounder? Absolutely. I have him in my top 10 in terms of the receivers. And, look, went over 1,000 yards in both seasons with Liberty, showed up to the Flames there as a junior. As a senior, in 13 games, 79 catches, 1,396 yards. That's 17.7 yards per reception and 10 touchdowns. Back-to-back seasons with 10 touchdowns as well. So a guy who is extremely productive, big physical receiver that fits exactly what I was talking about, what Baltimore's receiving core needs. So they get that at the end of round number 3. So we're looking at round number 4. And round number 4, their first pick, they've got quite a few picks in round 4. And first pick is number 129, again from New England. And I'm looking at that safety position. And the reason being is you've got Earl Thomas at the free safety position, but who's going to play strong safety? Right now, Chuck Clark is penciled in there, but I think you could probably do better there at that position. And I'm looking at Antoine Brooks Jr. out of Maryland. Now, Antoine Brooks, at the combine measured in 5'11", 220 pounds, ran a 4.64 40. A guy who is going to be that physical presence on the back end of your defense. I think there is some stiffness to his game, so I don't think he's going to be somebody that you're going to be counting on to line up in the slot. When you got a guy like Earl Thomas, you don't really have to worry about that as much. But again, a guy who can play in the box and be another physical linebacker, if you will, there in the box. 27 and a half tackles for loss in his career, 4 interceptions, 9 pass breakups, to go along with 237 tackles, really in 3 seasons there with the Terps. I think he's a guy who can come in, challenge Chuck Clark for that starting position, and probably be a guy who's going to end up winning that spot when it's all said and done. Look, Darnell Savage coming from Maryland. You have Antoine Brooks coming from Maryland as well. I think it's really a nice fit. And, I saw this early on as really a nice target, and I think that's where they're going to go. So I'm looking at that defensive end and really, that the defensive line. Calais Campbell was traded to them from the Jaguars, and I look at Calais Campbell and really not only one of the best defensive ends in all of college football, but probably one of the best people in the draft as well. This is a guy who does a lot for his community. So it was kind of sad to see him leave Jacksonville for that reason. But, 33 years of age, he'll be under contract for 1 more season. So you do have to be mindful of that. How long is he going to stick around? Derek Wolfe, 30 years of age, just signed a 1-year, $3 million contract. There's not a lot of depth behind the two of them. So I'm looking at defensive end, and I really think this is where Baltimore gets to double up. So in round number 4, let's see, pick number 134, I'm looking at Rashard Lawrence out of LSU, 6'2", 308. This is a guy who likes to get up the field, not overly athletic. He's on the shorter side that you'd like to have at the 3 technique, but a guy who just always seems to make plays. This is a guy who isn't going to be flashy, but a guy that you want to have on your roster because he's somebody who can affect both the pass and the rush. 20 and a half tackles for loss, 9 sacks in his career, 7 pass breakups as well. A guy who just gets a good push, gets a good push up the field. And if you're not careful, yeah, he's going to make some plays behind the line of scrimmage. You have to really know where he is on the field at all times. And then you move on from him at number 143 overall. Interesting, 134, now 143, a compensatory selection. I'm looking at Nick Coe out of Auburn, 6'5", 280 pounds. Really weird that he lined up at the linebacker position at the combine, because Nick Coe really is really a 3-4 defensive end. He's a 5 technique. So I thought that was interesting. But I'm looking at Nick Coe, and at the combine, let's see, ran a, where'd he go? Oh, I sorted. Oh, there we are. Yeah, ran a 4.8940. So there's only one linebacker that was slower than him at the combine there with that. So ran that 4.89. Would have liked to have seen him run with the defensive lineman, because that 4.89 among that group, that would actually put him in the top 20 in that group. So, and really, when you're talking about defensive tackles, yeah, and he's one of those guys that can translate. He is a 3-4 defensive end, but more of a tackle type. A bigger guy than you're really seeing that speed. Jason Strowbridge ran a 4.89. Ross Blacklock ran a 4.940. Robert Windsor with a 4.9. Matabuike ran a 4.83. Justin Matabuike out of Texas A&M. Obviously Neville Gallimore ran the 4.79, and Khalil Davis ran a 4.75. But there weren't too many guys his size running that fast at the combine. And so Nick Coe, though, kind of, this is a guy who there's more potential than there really was production. I thought as a sophomore, really had a breakout year, 13 and a half tackles for loss, 7 sacks, but, played in just 9 games. 2019 also played in 9 games, but really was kind of an afterthought. Didn't really see the field a whole lot, especially, when he's playing behind the likes of Marlon Davidson. But on the opposite side, he couldn't beat out Big Cat Bryant. So there is definitely some concern there, but I think the athleticism is there. And at the end of round number 4, I think that's probably the right slot for Nick Coe. He could slide into round number 5 just because of the lack of production. And, really he has to answer the question, why wasn't he out on the football field? Yes, there's a lot of talent there at Auburn, but man, if you're going to play in the NFL, you've got to be able to make it out onto the football field. And if you can't make it out onto the field, on your own college team, what makes you expect that you can get out onto the field in the NFL? I still think there's enough athleticism there to bring him in. And, round number 4, kind of makes some sense for me. So I think that's ultimately what's going to end up happening. And then round number 5, for Baltimore, I mentioned Matt Skura and his health. Baltimore sitting there at 158 overall. They got the pick from Atlanta, and I worry a little bit about Matt Skura and his health. He actually had a decent season. He's in the last year of his deal. Really an ugly leg injury during week 12. So I think you need to find somebody who, if they don't go with Cesar Ruiz, and that's one of the things we haven't talked about yet. Kenneth Murray could potentially be off the board. They may be turned off by the fact that he looks more like an outside linebacker than an inside backer at this point. Tremendous, looked a lot better when Caleb Kelly came in and manned the inside, allowing him to roam free on the back end. So they could go with a guard center combo guy like Cesar Ruiz out of Michigan, who I think is the best interior lineman in this draft. That's entirely possible. I wouldn't rule it out, but if they don't go that direction, I think they can wait until round number 5 and get a very serviceable center in Jake Hansen, 6'4", 303, a guy over 40 starts in his career with the Ducks, very intelligent guy, not the most athletic offensive lineman. I think there is some there are some limitations there. His lateral agility is lacking a little bit. Got beaten sometimes off the ball as well, but when you look at Hansen, that definitely showed the 5.5 40. But look, he's not going to really be running 40 times there at the interior line position. But 33 reps in the bench press, so he absolutely is able to manhandle some guys at the point of attack, and that's really what you saw there out of the Ducks offensive line. Period. So when you're looking at the Ducks, and you're talking about guys like Shane Lemieux and Calvin Throckmorton, guys who may not be the best athlete in the world, but they're going to be technically sound. They're coached by Mario Cristobal, himself a former offensive lineman, and they're really tough. And that's one of the things that I think I look at Jake Hansen, especially with what the Ravens want to do. I think this is a guy who can end up working his way not only onto the roster, but could end up being a starter for them, especially if Matt Skura cannot go. So that's really what I have there in round number 5. I think some people have Hansen coming off the board in 6 or 7. I think he's somebody, because of his toughness, because of the way that he was coached, because of, he is technically sound. I think he can get a shot there in round number 5. So we're done with Baltimore, and we're moving on to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now the Steelers, again, they traded away their first round pick to Miami as part of the Minkah Fitzpatrick deal. But you're looking at them in round number 2. They can go in a few different directions. I'm actually going with a little bit of a curveball. I'm looking at more kind of a best player available that could potentially be on their board. And I'm looking at that receiver position. They have Juju Smith-Schuster. There's James Washington on the roster, Deontay Johnson, who could play in the slot, Ryan Switzer, another slot type guy. They need a big physical dude, and a guy who's a pretty good athlete too. And James Washington, I think, could potentially be that complimentary guy for Juju. But I thought Juju's, overall his production dropped with the absence of Antonio Brown. And I'm looking at Chase Claypool. I mean, if you look at this guy at Notre Dame, I don't know what they feed these receivers at Notre Dame. After Miles Boykin, what he did at the combine, I was like, there's no way Chase Claypool is going to do this. He should be a tight end. There's no way that we're going to see the same type of production. What does Claypool do? Measuring at 6'4", 238 pounds, runs a 4.4 240, 40.5-inch vertical leap. Just absolutely ridiculous. The type of athleticism that he was displaying. And look, he could still end up bulking up and being a tight end. I mean, they have Eric Ebron and Vance McDonald on the roster, but you get another big physical dude there on the outside, and a guy that can run that fast. We see what DK Metcalf was able to do for Seattle. You bring in Claypool, there's some people talking about Claypool being a first-round pick. I don't know that I would go quite that far just yet. But there's no doubt, he can be a red zone nightmare, a guy that makes plays on the outside as well, a guy who can get vertical, can get behind defenses. In his first year without Miles Boykin there, 66 receptions, over 1,000 yards, 13 touchdowns, 15.7 yards per reception as well. A guy who has a tremendous catch radius, very reliable hands, a guy that doesn't really have an issue with drops, very natural pass catcher, brings that basketball mentality as well. Is basketball on a football field. Is he going to ultimately be a Pittsburgh Steeler? I think, the fact that he has that tight end type build. I'm looking at, the Raiders with Darren Waller, a team that really wants to find another tight end like that. Pittsburgh may not be the answer, but I started looking at their roster, started looking at, what they could do. And really with the production of Juju Smith-Schuster, they don't have really this big physical receiver on the outside. And this hulking presence of Chase Claypool just seemed to make some sense. So that's ultimately why I went with that move. A lot of people may disagree with that, but I think it could end up working out really well for Mason Rudolph there at the quarterback position. Moving on to round number 3, and Pittsburgh, I actually had them at one time taking Curtis Weaver in round number 2. I think Weaver's stock is kind of dropping a little bit. Didn't perform at the combine. And I think that kind of hurt him a little bit in terms of his draft stock, because when you look at the linebacking core, they have TJ Watt and they have Bud Dupree and they have little else at that outside linebacker position. Bud Dupree also, they had to use a franchise tag on him. So you worry about how long he's going to be sticking around. And how about a guy like Jonathan Greenard, out of Florida? A guy who was a transfer, started out his career at Louisville, and in 2017, 15.5 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, had the devastating injury in 2018, but comes back to Florida, 53 tackles, 16 going for loss, 10 sacks, 4 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles. A guy who, has a nice burst coming off the edge, really works hard to get to the quarterback. I think, he attacks that outside shoulder, does a really good job bending, coming off the edge, getting low off that the pad level, uses his hands really well. He has a nice chop and rip. Also uses a club coming off the edge as well. A guy who I think can rush the passer on the inside a little bit, especially if an offensive tackle is going to overset on him. Ran a 4.87 at the combine, not the fastest at all, but 6'3", 263 pounds. Ended up 30.5-inch vertical leap. But you look at the 3-cone drill. Ran a 7.13 3-cone drill. And when you're talking about the prospects, there's only one guy that was faster, and that was Derek Tuska out of North Dakota State. Ran an insane 6.87 in that 3-cone drill. What you see with the 3-cone drill, can he sink his hips? Can he really explode? And that's one of the things that I think he can definitely do. He can change directions, explode coming off the edge. I think that'd be a nice pickup there. And if ultimately Bud Dupree ends up leaving after 2020, you could potentially have a guy that could step in and be a starter there opposite TJ Watt. Pittsburgh, round number 4. I think the interior of that linebacking core also needs to be addressed as well. Inside linebackers, they have Devin Bush, Vince Williams. I think there's kind of a question mark there with him. One of my favorite players, in any draft, Ulysses Gilbert is sitting there on the roster as well. He's more of a special teams guy, although I'd love to see him get a shot. Because he's a guy that, if you wanted to line up over the slot, he's got a tremendous athleticism. He can cover slot receivers. He did that at Akron. A guy who can rush the passer, volume tackler, playing sideline to sideline. I think he's got some skill, and I hope he gets a chance to showcase that there in Pittsburgh. But when you're looking at the inside linebacker position, Vince Williams, under contract, he's 30 years of age now, under contract through 2021. But again, no real depth behind them. You have, like I said, you have Gilbert, was drafted in the 6th round a year ago. Is he going to be the answer? I think he's one of those guys. He's kind of undersized, much like Devin Bush is. I'm not really sure how all of that is going to play out right now. So I had to think about things and think about, someone that you can bring in and really be a presence out there. And I'm looking at Marcus Bailey out of Purdue. And Marcus Bailey, look, a guy who, I was expecting to have a huge year, and unfortunately injury kind of cut things out for him. And Bailey measured in 6 foot, 235 pounds. But as I said, injury cut his season short. And if I can get his stats pulled up here, I just had him up. Let's see. So here we go. In 2018, Jeff Brom and the Purdue Boilermakers, really having that breakout year. Tyler Trent, they beat Ohio State. And really the leader of that defense was, in fact, Marcus Bailey. 115 tackles that season, 9 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, had a pick. Look, as a redshirt freshman, had 4 interceptions, 97 tackles. Only played in 2 games this year, battling injury. But look, 324 tackles in his career. A big season from a tackle standpoint. He possibly could have ended up with 400 tackles in his career. 28 tackles for loss, 14.5 sacks. So he knows how to get after the quarterback. 6 interceptions, 6 pass breakups. A guy who could do a little bit of everything. He could be a 3-down linebacker. He really feels a lot like a New England type linebacker. And he reminds me a lot of Jawan Bentley, who was a Purdue linebacker that ultimately went to New England. And I'm looking at Marcus Bailey, and I'm looking at that Steelers linebacking core, and I still feel like he can end up in New England, and that could potentially be where some of my mock drafts towards the end of the year. Before the end of these 3 weeks, I could potentially adjust him and find a home for him in New England. But, I think the Steelers, what they want to do, getting another athletic linebacker, I think it does make some sense. You saw them bring in Ulysses Gilbert, who has some of that ability as well. I think it would just be a nice blend, a nice fit. And I think he can push Vince Williams for playing time. Again, as long as he can stay healthy, I think he definitely would have a home there at the next level. And then offensive line in round number 4. I think you got to protect Mason Rudolph. You got to protect that quarterback. This is a guy, who, Devlin Hodges is his backup. I think, Pittsburgh could very well end up looking for a quarterback at some point in the draft. I wouldn't rule that out. But I'm looking at this roster, and I'm looking at, Matt Filer is the right tackle. He's penciled in to be the starter, and he's signed just through this season. So I'm looking at Filer, and there's really nobody else there on the right side. Obviously at left tackle, you've got Alejandro Villanueva. You have Chuko Okorafor, the the Western Michigan product. There over at left tackle as well. He could potentially slide over to right tackle. Zach Banner, a guy that plays all over the line. He's also on the roster. Derwin Gray. Really, I feel that he's more of a guard. Derwin Gray is. But he's penciled in as a potential tackle as well. But I really think they need to look offensive tackle as somebody that can really challenge Matt Filer and potentially end up taking over for him if he ends up leaving. And I'm looking at Ben Barch out of St. John's in Minnesota. This is a guy who I initially had coming off the board in round number 3, and I think that's still possibly where he could end up going. 6'6", 309, and if you watched him in the postseason, he looked like he belonged. He was one of those guys that really lined up in those one-on-one drills and showed some physicality, showed some good footwork, and a guy who was coming from a Division III school. And I think he has a chance to not only make a roster, but can be a starter early on in his career. And looking at him in round number 4, going to the Steelers, if he doesn't go in round number 3, I think, this does make a lot of sense for Pittsburgh to really jump on getting a tackle like this. 135 overall, the pick that they got from Tennessee. I'd really like to see that happen, for Pittsburgh getting that offensive tackle, and I'd be really happy for Ben Barch to come off the board early day 3, if at all possible. So that's really what I have for the AFC North. I think there's a lot of room for optimism. I think Cincinnati bringing in Joe Burrow and really seeing what they can do with Zac Taylor. I think Baker Mayfield getting some of that protection up front. That's really what I'm excited about more than anything else, because frankly, they didn't give that defense much of a shot. A lot of times that offense was having to put the defense back out onto the field. Just a tired defense is not going to be a very effective defense. Baltimore, if they can address that defense a little bit to run with Lamar Jackson, they're going to be scary in that division. And then the Pittsburgh Steelers, just whenever anyone counts them out, Mike Tomlin really finds things. And I mentioned Mason Rudolph and being that guy to throw to Chase Claypool. Remember, Ben Roethlisberger's still on the roster, and if Big Ben's healthy, it's going to be his team. I'm thinking more, when I talk about Mason being the quarterback, I'm thinking more down the road and long term. Ben, the last of the 3 quarterbacks, Eli Manning has retired. Phillip Rivers has moved on from the Chargers. He's in Indianapolis, but how many more years does he have to go? So Ben Roethlisberger, the last of that trio to really still be hanging around on his, the same franchise. And I think he'll be the quarterback there as long as he can stay healthy and for as long as he really wants to play. I think Mike Tomlin will allow that to happen. Mason Rudolph, I think he does need to get a fair shake there. You lose some guys. When you lose Le'Veon Bell, you lose a guy like AB. You're losing some of those tools, and you're bound to struggle a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see how the Steelers rebound in 2020 with Big Ben at the helm. But I think you can get some additional pieces there, both on offense and defense to really help them make a push. So that is it for episode 28 of the Ready for the Draft 2020 podcast series. Next podcast, we're going to go ahead and get another one released here in the next couple of days. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the NFC South. So NFC South, Carolina, you've got Matt Rule going in there. You're seeing him bring in a lot of Temple guys in free agency. You figure he'll probably be eyeing Baylor a little bit as well. Nobody in round number one from either of those schools, but Matt Rule really looking to, I guess, retool, restock, and rebuild in Carolina. I think defensive tackle, if Isaiah Simmons is on the board, I think they have to take Simmons to really replace Luke Kuechly. With him off the board, I think Derek Brown makes a ton of sense going to Carolina. If we continue to move along there, Tampa Bay, you got to protect the GOAT. You got to protect Tom Brady. If Brady has a say in who's going to be on the roster, I think he's looking at that offensive line and says, I need an upgrade on my offensive line stat. And so I think, Tristan Wirfs, potentially, Andrew Thomas, whoever that number 3, number 4 tackle in that group, I think that makes a ton of sense. They're, more than likely to play right tackle opposite Donovan Smith. Atlanta, this is another team that looks like they're in a state of rebuild. A lot of guys let go and released. I think they still need to address the pass rush. Vic Beasley's gone. Kalavan Chason, fits what Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff. It really fits that mold. That makes a ton of sense. You get one of the better pass rushers in this year's draft. So I think that definitely has to make a ton of sense for them. And then finally, the New Orleans Saints. And we talked about them a little bit already. I think they need to find some additional weapons there for Drew Brees. I think addressing some of the holes there defensively is a must. Offensive line, they have Andrus Peat coming back. What's going to happen there up front for them? There's a few question marks, but I don't think there are as many holes to the Saints roster as there are for the other 3 teams in the division. So I think the Saints still going to be the favorite to come out of the NFC South. Even with Tom Brady on the roster there in Tampa Bay, I think they've got to shore up that offensive line. They got to fix the defensive woes a little bit. Tom Brady, I think we're really talking more about 2021, really seeing Tampa Bay move on. But you know what? I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. Don't count out Bruce Arians. Don't count out the GOAT. At the end of the day, Tom Brady's done more with less. And when you got Mike Evans and you've got Chris Godwin, as receivers out there, and you've got a tight end like OJ Howard. Can't forget Cameron Braid as well. Ronald Jones as the running back. Who knows? Who knows? If you can protect him, then you got a chance. So that's what we're going to take a look at in the next couple of days, and then after that, we'll look at the AFC South as well. And then I promise shortly after that, we'll get into the NFC and AFC West. We'll go from basically moving from the East Coast to the West Coast with this free agency look by division and really how that is impacting the draft overall. So I hope you've enjoyed the content. I hope you've enjoyed the ride. I can't believe the draft is just a few weeks away, April 1st, and the draft on April 23rd, unless something changes with COVID-19 and everything, I think we're expecting the draft to go ahead and kick off on April 23rd. I'm excited to see what they do with this league, with the draft, what the league does. Until then, I'm going to try to bring as many podcasts as I can, really take a look at position by position. That's what we'll do next. And we'll take a look at my final mock draft right before the draft itself, and then we'll obviously do a post-draft coverage, really take a look at each team, who they brought in, where they went right, where they went wrong, how it all is going to play out from a roster standpoint, and what to expect in that 2020 NFL season. So until next time, stay safe, everyone. Make sure you wash your hands, practice your social distancing, and hopefully this has been a little bit of a relief for you, an avenue where you can just take your mind off of things for a little bit. And, if you've enjoyed the content, please come back, listen again. For readyforthedraft.com, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast. I've been your host, Gregg Schutze. Take care, everyone, and I am out of here.